The truth of Ivalice has been buried for centuries. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter as we unearth it together. Final Fantasy Tactics isn't just a story about nobles and commoners fighting over a throne. That's the surface. Underneath the betrayals, assassinations, and church politics is something much older. Something that feels like it belongs to the bones of the world itself. The Zodiac Stones. To the common folk, these were holy relics, miracles that proved the gods were real. To the church, they were tools of control. To Ramza, they were the most dangerous curse Ivalice had ever known. And standing in the middle of all this myth and manipulation are the so-called Zodiac Braves. To the church, they're legends. To historians, they're symbols. But to Ramza and his companions, they were demons. The Lucavi, wearing the skin of a fairy tale. Today, we're going to pull apart this story piece by piece. The myth of the Zodiac Braves, the reality of the Lucavi inside the stones, the Church of Glabados' manipulation of both, and how this thread ties Ivalice together across centuries of Final Fantasy lore. The official legend goes like this. 1,000 years before Ramza's time, the world was falling into chaos. Demons roamed freely, threatening mankind. Out of that darkness rose 12 heroes, each carrying a Zodiac Stone. These warriors, the Zodiac Braves, defeated Ultima, the High Seraph, and sealed her away. Civilization was saved, the Church of Glabados rose, and the world entered a new age. It's a simple, inspiring story. Too simple. The problem is, like most propaganda, the truth was messier. The Dry Papers, the suppressed, hidden history of the War of the Lions, tells us the stones weren't divine gifts. They were containers. Each one held a Lucavi, a dark being tied to the Zodiac. And Saint Ajora, the church's prophet, he wasn't just a holy man. He was possessed by Ultima herself, the leader of the Lucavi. So every time someone in Final Fantasy Tactics reverently mentions the Zodiac Braves, the real question is, are they talking about the fairy tale? Or are they accidentally talking about the nightmare Ramza uncovered? There are 13 stones in total. 12 for the zodiac signs we all know, and one more, Serpentarius, that stands apart. To the commoner in Ivalice, the stones were relics from a bygone age. They could heal wounds, raise the dead, and prove the gods were watching. But here's the catch. Every stone housed a Lucavi. And when a human, desperate, broken, or greedy, held one, the Lucavi inside whispered promises of salvation. The result was always the same. Cardinal Delacroix, desperate to hold power, used the Scorpio Stone and became Cuchulainn. Wiegraf Foals, once a rebel with noble ideas, fell into despair and fused with the Ares Stone. Belias. Ramza Beoulve, Ramza's own brother, grasped Capricorn and turned into Adramelech. Marquis Elmdor, aristocrat and manipulator, became Zalera through the Gemini Stone. Every time, the pattern repeats. A human reaches their breaking point. The stone answers, and the Lucavi devours the host. But the stones weren't only about demons. They could do strange, miraculous things. Mustadio Bonanza's story in Gug shows this perfectly. His family digs up a stone, thinking it's an ancient relic. That stone awakens Worker 8, a colossal machine from the Lost Age. A miracle, sure. But that same stone also drew the Lucavi's attention. That's the paradox of auracite. Unimaginable power, always with a catch. So who, or what, are the Lucavi? They're not just boss monsters. They're the shadow of Ivalice's mythology. The Lucavi are dark scions, reflections of the Zodiac signs twisted into demonic form. In Final Fantasy Tactics, they appear as grotesque, otherworldly beings. But in Final Fantasy XII, you meet them again, this time as espers, enslaved scions bound to serve humanity after their rebellion against the gods. Here's the Final Fantasy Tactics roll call. Belias, the Gigas, Ares, Wiegraf's final form, a giant beast of fire and chains. Cuchulainn, the Impure, Scorpio, Cardinal Delacroix, grotesquely bloated and toxic, Zalera, the Angel of Death, Gemini, Marquis Elmdor, turned vampiric and spectral, Adramelech, the Wrath, Capricorn, Ramza Beoulve, consumed by ambition, Hashmal, bringer of order, Leo, Fulmarv Tengil, Knight Templar commander, Ultima, the High Seraph, Serpentarius, the puppet master behind it all. The terrifying thing about the Lucavi isn't their strength, it's their patience. They don't force their way into the world. They wait. They whisper. And when a human is desperate enough, they reach out. And that's all it takes. Wiegraf's fall is the most tragic example. He begins the story as a man fighting for the poor, disillusioned by noble corruption. But by the time he finds the Ares stone, he's lost his army, his cause, and his sister. He doesn't want power for glory. He wants revenge. The stone gives it to him. The Lucavi don't invent his despair. They just weaponize it. So, if the stones were cursed, who were the Zodiac Braves? The Church says they were 12 chosen heroes who defeated Ultima and sealed her away after Ajora's death. But the dry papers make it clear. The Braves weren't chosen. They weren't saints. They were survivors who managed to shut Ultima down during the chaos that followed Ajora's execution and Milan's sinking. And then there's Ramza's time. The new Zodiac Braves. Ramza, Agrias, Orlandu, Mustadio, Alma, and their allies. They're the ones who actually defeat the Lucavi one by one and prevent Ultima's resurrection. But history doesn't remember them. The Church brands them heretics. Centuries later, the world remembers the fable, not the truth. The only reason we know about Ramza at all is because Oren Durai risked everything to write the hidden history. He was executed for it, and only 400 years later did his descendant, Arazlam, publish the papers. By then, it was too late. Ramza's name had already been erased. This is where the story turns from myth into something chillingly real. Because the Church of Glabados didn't just tell stories, they rewrote history. They took Ajora's death and turned it into sainthood. They took the Lucavi and reframed them as demons vanquished by holy warriors. They called the stones auracite and branded their miracles proof of divine favor. And when Ramza exposed the truth, they called him a heretic. This wasn't fantasy, this was propaganda. And it worked. The masses believed the church's story for centuries. Delita, politically useful and easier to sell, became the official savior of Ivalice. Ramza became a ghost. The part I love most about this subplot is how it trickles down to ordinary people. To peasants, the stones weren't curses. They were hope. Proof that the gods were watching. To nobles, they were bargaining chips, a way to wield divine legitimacy. To the church, they were a monopoly on miracles. Even gameplay shows this duality. The stones can resurrect the dead, heal the dying, or unlock ancient machines. They're carrots and sticks. Salvation for those who obey, damnation for those who resist. That's the genius of Final Fantasy Tactics. The Lucavi aren't just monsters. They're metaphors for power in Ivalice. Dangerous, seductive, and never free. Everything comes back to Ultima, the High Seraph. Ajora was her host in the past. Alma is nearly consumed by her in the present. And when you descend into the Necro Hall beneath Mirand, it all comes to a head. When you fight Ultima, you're not just battling another boss. You're fighting centuries of lies, ambition, and bloodshed. If Ramza loses, the church's story becomes reality. If he wins, the truth dies with him. And that's exactly what happens. Ramza defeats Ultima, saves Alma, and disappears. History crowns Delita king, while Ramza's name is buried under the label of heretic. That's the gut punch of Final Fantasy Tactics. The true Zodiac Braves save the world, and the world never knows. The Lucavi don't stop with Final Fantasy Tactics. In Final Fantasy XII, you summon the same beings. Belias, Zalera, Adramelech, Hashmal, Ultima, but as espers, bound by contract. The lore calls them the Scions of Darkness, rebels against the Acuria. The parallel is unmistakable. The Lucavi are the same Scions, filtered through myth. In Final Fantasy XII, Belias is your first Esper. In Final Fantasy Tactics, he's Wiegraf's doom. In Final Fantasy XII, Adramelech lurks in the Zertanan Caverns. In Final Fantasy Tactics, he devours Dice Dark. In Final Fantasy XII, Ultima is sealed in Giruvegan. In Final Fantasy Tactics, she tries to claw her way back into the world. It ties the Ivalice saga together. The same beings reappear across eras, reshaped by history, myth, and memory. So why does any of this matter? Because the Zodiac Stones aren't just plot devices. They're the backbone of Final Fantasy Tactics themes. They show that power is never free, that institutions will twist truth into propaganda, that myths are written by the victors, not the heroes. Ramza and his allies were the true Zodiac Braves. They fought the Lucavi, stopped Ultima, and saved the world. But because their story didn't serve the Church's narrative, it was erased. That's what makes Final Fantasy Tactics brilliant. It's not just a fantasy story, it's a history lesson about how power corrupts, how legends are forged, and how truth can be buried for centuries. And that's the legacy of the Zodiac Stones, the Lucavi, and the Braves who fought them. Just like Ramza's story, this channel only survives if it's remembered. Like, share, comment, and keep the legacy alive. Until next time, thanks for watching.